It is a tremendous honor to introduce our next speaker, Cornelius Blanding. Cornelius is the recipient of the 2019 James Beard Leadership Award, where he was honored for his dedication to develop and strengthen cooperatives for low-income African American and other limited resource communities in the South. He has been working for over 20 years with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and Land Assistance Fund, and now serves as its executive director. The organization aims at getting land and with it self-sufficiency back into the hands of family farmers, especially those of African American descent. Today, Cornelius will be speaking to us about the Justice for Black Farmers Act. No doubt he will share this statistic, but I will share it here as it shocks the system. In 1960, more than 100,000 Black farmers owned 8 million acres of land. But over the decades, institutional racism, including systemic denial of access to bank credit, drastically ate away at Black farm ownership. Today, less than 20,000 Black farmers own just 2.3 million acres of land. And our last summit, we heard from a couple, June and Angie, who are folks that have had that outcome in their farming life. We must do better. Cornelius, thank you for your time today and for bringing focus to this very, very important issue.
So then, thank you. Thanks for having me. The panel before me, again, I got a chance to hear a few of the words, and I really want to, first of all, just kind of concur with some of the previous speakers before me. Arohi, in terms of the regenerative, really not pitting farmers against others. And I think that's absolutely correct. I think the basis of all that is really for us really to start truly understanding regenerative agriculture, and that it's a very broad term, and that all farmers really are, whether they realize it or not, are part of regenerative agriculture, making sure they understand that. And that sometimes means really dealing with the language barrier, making sure folks see themselves in it. And I think once we do that and all understand that they're part of regenerative agriculture, I think we can move the needle a whole lot further. Eric, in terms of really talking to farmers, you're absolutely right, because so many times we go out and we really don't spend enough time with farmers and hearing what their challenges are. But also, Eric, I add to that and say making sure that we include various farmers in all communities to make sure they're engaged, because there are differences in terms of the various communities as well. In understanding policy is really important for us to understand policy and figure out how we can all support that, including financially. And so really, I think all of us working together helps move the needle. Again, thanks for having me here. My name is Cornelius Blanding. I'm the executive director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. I've been with the Federation now for 24 years and 6 as the executive director. But I performed various duties within the Federation. I started out in our office in Alabama, working directly with our training center around revolving loan funds, and moved to Atlanta to spend time with our international programs, much of our marketing efforts, also directing our field operations in multiple states, and then served as the deputy director for my predecessor, Ralph Page. And as the last 6 years, again, I've been the executive director of the organization. So have been here serving this organization and our membership for 24 years. Let me just say a little bit about the Federation and who we are. The Federation is simply a cooperative association of Black farmers, landowners, and cooperatives all around the South. Our organization was founded directly out of the Civil Rights Movement in 1967. It was founded by 22 cooperatives. Cooperatives basically being businesses owned and controlled by those farmers, those landowners, those low-income folks in their communities. So we had cooperatives that were being formed as early as the 30s, all the way into the 60s. But those cooperatives came together during the time of the Civil Rights Movement in various ways for various reasons. And they met in 1966 to really talk about the idea of forming an organization that could support them and continue the cooperative movement in the South and among Black communities as part of the Civil Rights Movement. So our organization is pretty much a convergence of the cooperative movement in the South and the Civil Rights Movement. In '67, the Federation was created, and it was created to pretty much do a few things. And one, to continue to build, support, and develop cooperatives as a tool for economic development to build and support those communities. Those cooperatives that I mentioned, all of them were formed out of necessity. You had farmers in Alabama and sharecroppers in Alabama who were being kicked off their lands for registering to vote, and they had to form land buying co-ops so that they can continue to live in the South and own their own housing. You had farmers in Mississippi and Louisiana who were selling sweet potatoes and watermelon who couldn't sell them for a fair price. They had to form trucking co-ops to send them to places like Chicago just to get a price where they could live on. You had low-income residents in Florida who had to form credit unions so that they can get access to credit to deal with the basic necessities of life. You had other farmers in Tennessee and so on who couldn't buy gas or other inputs on their farms from their white neighbors, and so they went across state lines to get inputs. So those were the building blocks or the foundational pieces that made up the cooperatives that created the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. So that's who we are. Our focus is around three things: cooperative economic development, land retention, and advocacy. And I say land retention because Celine, you mentioned some statistics, and there's one simple statistic that we've been operating over 50 years on, and that's the statistics that came from the U.S. Census Bureau. In 1910, there were 218,000 Black farmers owning 15 million acres of land. Before the turn of the century, according to the 92 census, there were only 18,000 Black farmers owning a little over 2 million acres of land. There was a commission put together in 1982 that said that by the year 2000, there would be no Black-owned land if it continued at the rate in which it was going, which they estimated was about 1,000 acres today. So Black folks were and still are losing land at an alarming rate and at a rate higher than others. And so it's a huge problem in our communities. And the reason for that land loss is numerous, but I'll tell you about three pretty much. One, discrimination is plain and simple. There's been a lot of discrimination over the years in various forms that have caused land loss. But also there's been a lack of access to credit and other resources that have caused that land loss. And third, a simple thing called heirs property, which is simply a landowner passing away, not having a will or an estate plan, and the land is passed down to many heirs to the landowner's children. Over the generations, that continues, and before you know it, you got multiple generations, you got multiple owners, sometimes hundreds, and you have no clear title. And most of the resources in our country, mostly from USDA, particularly, you have to have a clear title. To get access to certain loans and credit, you have to have a clear title. And this heirs property situation is a very unsecured title, and it prevents access to those resources, credit and others. And so it has been a part of that land loss. The latter two, the lack of access to credit and resources and heirs property, have most times been intertwined with discrimination. Simply put, USDA, the biggest lawsuit in this country was Pickford versus Glickman, the Black farmer lawsuit. And the primary reason of it is that Black farmers couldn't get access to credit at USDA, the place where we're supposed to provide lending, the lender of last resort, they call themselves. They weren't able to get credit, and it was proven and it was admitted because of discrimination. And you have heirs property laws that are state laws. Heirs property is a creature of the states, and so it varies in different states. But for the most part, in every state is similar. And so you have these laws that prevent folks from accessing these resources in these various states because of this heirs property situation or this unclear title. And so it's been a major reason for land loss. But there's a number of things that can be done because of that. One, advocacy. We've been advocating for 50 years around heirs property and other things in terms of getting good legislation in place that addresses heirs property. There was some legislation that came out a few years ago that was sponsored by Senator Doug Jones that dealt with heirs property laws at USDA. So it's been a huge benefit, but it also had things like an heirs property relending program where folks could get the resources to buy out the many heirs on the property and help clear title that way. Many of those things have yet to come to fruition, but these laws help. We're working on and thinking about uniform heirs property laws that are to customize or make the laws look similar across the states. But at the end of the day, advocacy plays a major role in really dealing with these kind of issues and making sure that there's equity in the legislation. The bill, the Justice for Black Farmers Act, is one of those pieces of legislation that we're very high on, that we're excited about. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a giant leap in the right direction and something that can really help. Has to be worked out, and there's a lot of things that's going on currently. So really looking at advocacy to support those kind of issues. Developing co-ops is a tool that we use, looking at really pulling folks together to have cooperatively owned institutions. And in this case, dealing with things like lack of access to credit, we're thinking of a cooperatively owned financial institution that's owned by Black farmers, where they can lend to themselves. They can own the kind of institutions and make the decisions that are made with each other. And look, again, heirs property legislation as part of the whole advocacy efforts. And last but not least, really kind of focusing resources, looking at various things, whether it's awareness, education, training, direct technical assistance, and providing infrastructure, but really some focused resources, which go a long ways in terms of helping solve this issue. There's quite a few barriers that Black farmers face in terms of dealing with success. And I just name a couple or three to be specific about it. But again, heirs property is one of the major issues in terms of a barrier for success. Because of this, we estimate that about 60% of the Black population, including farmers, have an heirs property issue. The majority of Black farmers are concentrated in the South. And again, it's been a major reason for the loss of land. And so this has also been a barrier for the success of farmers, because their loss of land, because their lack of access to credit, because of heirs property, and many other things. But also the scale. The majority of Black farmers operate usually 100 acres or less. And so really coming to scale with that kind of land base has been an issue, and it's a barrier to success. And what we do is work on aggregating those farmers and their businesses to create the kind of scale that they can build income, generate wealth, and really move past this barrier of success. And last but not least, access to equitable credit and resources. And so those are the things that are barriers. But again, we see some solutions to that. And again, this Justice for Black Farmers Act is one of those. There's many opportunities besides the Justice for Black Farmers Act. You also have the Emergency Relief for Farmers Act that was headed by Senator Warnock here in Georgia. And the Justice for Black Farmers Act was sponsored by Senator, what's his name, in New Jersey, Booker, Senator Booker's office, also signed on by Gillibrand and Elizabeth Warren's, Senator Warren's office. But those are two pieces of justice, pieces of legislation that is out there that we think are very beneficial, that provides an opportunity. Congress, the House, the Ag House Committee just passed the Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act, and a reconciliation bill that took in a part of that emergency relief. And so we're excited about that. That still has to go through the full Congress and has to go to Senate. But it has a lot of the parts from the Emergency Relief for Farmers Act in it. And hopefully some of the parts from the Justice for Black Farmers Act will be included. But those are some opportunities that exist right now. But outside of legislation, there's starting to be huge opportunities around forestry and agroforestry. Black farmers have been foresters. Many of their lands are in forests. Much of the heirs property land that we talk about is nothing more than unmanaged forests. So when we start talking about regenerative agriculture, looking at these unmanaged forests go a long way of being in part of the conversations about regenerative agriculture, really looking at sustainability, looking at soil health, and a forest play a huge part in that. So there's tremendous opportunities starting to emerge around forestry and agroforestry efforts, specifically around conservation. And last but not least, we see a huge amount of opportunity for cooperatives, really aggregating not only farmers, but also forest landowners, aggregating them so they can fully utilize the forestry industry, which they haven't been able to for various reasons. Not only discrimination, but again, because of scale. And so if you put all those things together, we think there's an opportunity to really move forward, not only move forward this legislation that is out there today, but move forward many of the programs and the resources, and really move this conversation around regenerative agriculture and others forward. Let me just spend a minute talking about the Justice for Black Farmers Act. Again, it was a bill originally sponsored by Senator Booker's office, has gotten quite a bit of traction. Not a perfect bill, but it's definitely some opportunities. That bill, again, has been overshadowed right now, for the lack of a better word, because of this reconciliation bill that's just been passed. The reconciliation bill has an agriculture part to it. I think $5 billion in there for farmers of color, $4 billion for debt relief, and $1 billion actually for technical assistance and various kind of programs, including heirs property, including these relending programs or these funding cycles like Black farmer financial institutions included in the $1 billion side of it. But all of it, again, connects back and came after this Justice for Black Farmers Act. And so the Justice for Black Farmers Act has quite a few titles that we think would be very appropriate and really do some good, which include looking at some reform at USDA to make sure discrimination doesn't continue to happen, putting equity commissions and things of that place, things of that nature in place so that somebody is monitoring. It has a land grant section on to really start putting land back in the hand of Black farmers to try to really substitute for a lot of that land was lost. Has funding for historically Black colleges and universities to provide the training, not only to farmers and communities, but of students to really build the base of farmers. Land retention, like I spoke of, and credit to really make sure we're addressing the heirs property issue and providing credit to Black farmers. But system reform overall, looking at the agricultural systems and providing some reform in that, including things like mediation and other things. So that's a snapshot of that act, of the Justice for Black Farmers Act. But again, the reconciliation bill that was just passed by in the House by the Ag Committee takes parts from that, and it's a $5 billion piece of legislation that has to now go before the whole Congress and then Senate. So we're very hopeful. And last but not least, I think there's a role for regenerative farming in the Black farming community. First of all, I think, and going back to the things that was mentioned about not pitting farmers against farmers, there's a tremendous opportunity to really look at the rural versus urban communities, the farming communities, and make sure that we show the distinction between those, but also show the connection. What's the common link? How do we all understand regenerative agriculture in a common way? And how do we work on it from the various perspectives? I'm really getting at it so that we understand that it's not something to divide us, but it's something that could unite us. Looking at new and beginning farmers versus older and traditional farming. Farming is starting to look different. We're talking about regenerative farming, but how do we show the traditional farmers or the older farmers that they've been doing regenerative farming all these years? It's nothing different. It's just how do we title it? How do we name it? What's the common language that we use so that we all understand it? Looking at those barriers and really providing some education and training around that. How do we bring all the parties to the table, provide education and training so that we understand it the same way, and then provide resources for this? How do we provide resources to these small scale farmers so that they understand how to build a forest or an agroforestry within a 30-acre context, if you will? When they don't have access to traditional markets, how do they build scale? How do they aggregate? How do they look at it from a regenerative farming perspective and really access all the markets and utilize the resources and provide marketing opportunities? We can talk about various types of farming, but if we don't connect it to marketing opportunities where a small farmer, a Black farmer, or any farmer can see the income generating opportunities there, it's all for naught. And so really fleshing out marketing opportunities and working collaboratively to build markets for the products that come from regenerative agriculture. And looking at the opportunities, last but not least, the opportunities to really strengthen existing policies and develop new policies, but with all at the table, where we then, again, not only have having conversations with farmers, but also having conversations with all the communities collectively at the table, where we're understanding the policies and supporting them in various ways from various perspectives, understanding that at the end of the day, we all have to look for the common ground here and realize that we all have something at stake. And I would end by saying this. One of the stories that has impacted me more than anything else was something that had happened about 7, 8 years ago in 2014, I think. And it was an issue that happened in Toledo, Ohio. There was what they call a toxic bloom in Toledo that shut down the water supply of 500,000 people. And our government was tasked with the force of cleaning that up and really solving that problem. But that issue happened because the runoff of a farm, the runoff ran down into Lake Erie and met with algae that's in Lake Erie just at the right time and created a perfect storm. You had an algae or toxin, you had algae, you had the pesticide, that runoff, and you had the sun that created a perfect storm and caused this algae toxic bloom. It's not an anomaly. EPA reported years ago that algae is sitting in every body of water in every state in our country. The sun is a normal part of life. All it is waiting on is runoff from a farm, whether it's urban or rural, to cause a toxic bloom that shuts down our water supply in a state, in a region, or possibly in our country. And we all share in that. Regenerative agriculture is a part of the solution for that, because all it is about having healthy soil, healthy water, and healthy air. And that's what every farmer lives to do based on their practices, whether they practice it intentionally or not. But how do we make sure that it's intentional, that we all understand it the same way? We're just tackling it from different perspectives. And when we understand it that way, when we approach it that way, when we provide the resources, the education, the training, and build policy that way, I think we then start solving our problems around climate change, around the issues that affect our water, affect our soils, and affect our air. So this is a common problem. We just have to understand it as a common problem, develop common language, and work on it with all at the table to find a common solution. With that, I'll end and see if there's questions for me.
Thank you, Cornelius. You touched on sort of the marketing opportunities, or just without them, it's all for naught. So could you talk a little bit about maybe who some of your best partners have been, or just an example of maybe, projects you would like to see place or support, from businesses or partners? Like, what sort of relationships would you like to see evolve?
Thanks. Great question. So let me talk about some of the things that we're doing. One of the things we're looking at, again, when we think about forestry, again, most farmers have some kind of forest on their farm, some land that they're not using that might be unmanaged. And again, in the case of most Black farmers, a large 60% have heirs property. And again, most heirs property is unmanaged forest. So we're looking at our forestry efforts and looking at those small scale landowners, typically 30 acres or less in terms of forestry, and figuring out how they aggregate so that they can harvest. Our issues usually come with harvesting. When you start talking about the harvesting companies and corporations, they're not going to send this large equipment on a 30-acre plot to harvest. It's not cost effective. And so you end up having these farmers, these Black farmers, these small farmers who end up with unharvested land, unmanaged land. So really aggregating them so that they can harvest collectively, or getting access to the tools that they can own cooperatively. So we're starting to work with corporations like John Deere to look at some equipment that's appropriate for small scale landowners if down the long term. But in the short term, how do we get the larger equipment, aggregate producers to own it, control it, and utilize it together? We're also looking at issues like biomass. When you're not managing that forest, you have a lot of undergrowth. That undergrowth could be used. There are plants like in Viva that have come to Alabama, and it has a whole lot of issues, whole lot of problems. But we think there's ways for us to look at sustainably utilizing the undergrowth to chop that up and to create wood chips for energy or whatever the other purposes are. So how do we marry those things and really solve some of the problems that are created by these corporations, and really look at them in a sustainable manner where they understand our challenge, what we need to manage unmanaged forests deal with undergrowth and deal with things and not cutting down the trees or not clear cutting, but just cutting the undergrowth. So there's opportunity to look at equipment and for biomass and things of that nature. Again, things as simple as wood chippers. We've started to purchase a lot of wood chippers and demonstrating how farmers can use those and really manage the forest. So it then starts providing resources to get rid of this edge property issue, cover taxes, create income, but also solve problems around climate change and really deal with this issue around forest fires. Also, there's an opportunity to really start looking at infrastructure in these communities where communities can own regional infrastructure, whether it be transportation, storage, or processing facilities to really not only deal with stuff from the farm, products from the farm, but also from the forest. So there's a number of things that we're doing now. We have an MOU signed with the U.S. Forest Service, with the National Agroforestry Center and the National Resource Conservation Service, where we have a regional agroforestry center, and we're looking at training around that. We own 1,300 acres of land in Alabama, and so part of it is a forest demonstration. The majority of it is actually a forest demonstration where we're demonstrating to small-scale landowners and foresters how to manage their forests and what are some of these things to do, and really building these partnerships with these corporations like John Deere and others to really get the equipment that's needed there, but also how to aggregate around that and use some cooperative solutions.
And I know I was speaking with someone from Four Seasons Produce. What are some of the other crops or things being produced within the co-ops that you're working with?
Yeah, great question, and thank you, Nancy. So yeah, Four Seasons is one of the companies that we've been engaged with recently. But overall, we have what we call a regional marketing system. And in that system, we're simply looking at a lot of small farmers and making sure they're aggregated into cooperatives and they're to sell their products through their cooperatives in their local and state markets. But we're also aggregating those cooperatives into this regional marketing system where they have the scale to sell to larger companies and to sell not only regionally, but nationally and internationally. We've been looking at things like watermelon. We've been selling watermelon in the north, from the south directly to the north, places like Boston. We've been looking at collard greens, where we can process collard greens, put them in bags, sell them to people like Four Seasons with watermelon. We're also looking at things like sweet potatoes. So there are a number of things that we're looking at. Pecans, we have a number of small pecan growers. When you start talking about these unmanaged forests, some of this timber is pecan trees. Really buying pecans, we have a processing facility in South Georgia. We're buying pecans, aggregating the farmers and the co-ops, buying, processing those, selling those nationally, and looking at international markets. So there are a number of things, Nancy. We also were part of the solution when during the beginning of the pandemic, when USDA put this, what they call the food box program, food to families food box program. So we were able to buy food directly from small scale farmers, aggregate it, and send it out to the communities that were the most impacted by the pandemic. And so we've been sending things out like that, aggregating in a number of ways, and again, looking at international market as well.
Okay, so then, Wizapan had asked, how can Native peoples unite with our Black sisters and brothers to move these efforts forward? So many of our challenges have and are the same.
Yeah, definitely. It's a conversation that we have to continue to have. And the way I think about it, just to refer back to this Justice for Black Farmers Act, one of the things, and this emergency relief for farmers of color, it's an effort. Black farmers are talked about a lot, but it's an effort to really look at many farmers, especially many farmers of color, including Native American farmers. But one of the best approaches I always point to is that Black farmer lawsuit. That lawsuit was important to the Black farmers and to the Black farming community, but it also set precedent. It made the way for the Keep Siegel Act, for the Keep Siegel lawsuit, which was Native Americans, for the Hispanic lawsuit, for the women's lawsuit. So I think as we move forward, we have to always look at whatever we do as models to replicate or as precedents to really make sure that all of our communities are being touched and cared for. And so we have to continue to make sure that we're talking so that we understand our issues. Many of our issues are different, but many of them are the same. And how do we come together and really talk about those things that are the same? And again, regenerative agriculture, by any other name, is an area that's common to all of us if we look at it that way and really focus on what's common for all of us. So I think there's an opportunity for the Black farming community to work with the Native American farming community. I think we've done that historically, but we need to be a lot more intentional, really, to figure out how do we support one another. So those are conversations that I think should start to happen more in the future. And we're excited to start having those kind of conversations.
Someone was asking about the role for colleges and universities in the South, in helping to bring these conversations into the community or working with farmers. Are you working with any schools or a lot?
Yes, that has been a strategy of ours for over 30, 40 years. So as you know, there was the Morrill Act created land grant universities. And in the second Morrill Act in 1862 created Black land grant universities because Black farmers, Black communities weren't being served by those land grant universities that was created initially with the first Morrill Act. In 1862, these Black universities that were around saving seeds, around providing technical assistance to the farming communities, everything have been a bedrock in the Black farming community and for Black farmers. We, the Federation, have partnered with all those universities over the years, and again, going back close to 40 years. Every one of those universities have some kind of specialty. Tuskegee University, as an example, Tuskegee University, in terms of agriculture, is known for its veterinarian school. Alabama A&M in Alabama is known for forestry. Southern University is known for agricultural law. They have a law school. So the list goes on and on. So we partner with each one of those universities around their specialties and have been doing so for a number of years. Southern University send their law students and have been for probably 35 years. And I'm sorry, their veterinarians, Tuskegee has been sending their veterinarian students to us for at least 35 years, where they actually stay at our training center in Alabama, work with the livestock we have on site, mostly goat, but also work out in the community with cows, with goats, and any other livestock that Black farmers have, really making sure that they have access to quality veterinarian services and talking and educating them about various things, diseases, and really how to care for that herd. But also they're part of our agroforestry efforts in terms of introducing those herds to the forest and part of the whole farming equation. Southern University has been sending law students to us for probably a little over 15 years to really look at heirs property issues, the law around that in each state, and really educating not only communities about heirs property, but we are also spending time educating those young lawyers. So when they go back to their communities, when they start practicing law, they're very familiar with heirs property and the issue that disproportionately impacts our communities. That's also an issue that the Native Americans face around fractionated land. So there's many issues we have in common. There's many ways we can tackle this, and we got to figure out when we have solutions, when we find things that work, like these partnerships with the universities, how do we share those resources and deal with it in a collective way? So we do deal with these universities on a broad scale, and many of them around specific things, but also in terms of training those students. So when they go back out into their communities, they're educated around true agriculture.
Great. Well, I think that those are the questions that we've had. I'm just looking through here. I guess one of the other, one of the things that has come up that you did address, obviously it's fundamental here, is that the South, it's a challenging place in terms of just discriminatory attitudes. And so what are the pathways that policy can offer to bridge that underlying challenge? And I guess, you've mentioned the Justice for Black Farmers Act. Are there other changes that you're seeing or policy that you're seeing helping with that?
Well, what we're seeing is this Justice for Black Farmers Act, the Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act, and also this reconciliation bill that was just passed. Those are things that we're seeing that are starting to happen. But let me step back and really talk about from a wider perspective, if you will. So one of the things that I've always said is that poor policy perpetuates poverty. And when you look at our country, poverty is concentrated in the South. Black farmers, Black people are concentrated in the South. And that's by no accident. But it's a paradox, if you will. And so when the irony in all of this is this, I was at Duke University a couple of years ago, and I was asked to speak with some of the folks at a crew they had at Duke University, and they had an open-ended question that they posed and they just said, "What if?" And I answered that question by saying, what if all communities, own the assets of their communities? Now, I answered it like that because, and to answer this question, the way the South is set up is the South is not owned by the South. The South is not owned by the communities in the South. The South is not owned by Black people. And the communities where we live are not owned. And here's why this is important. At that meeting, there was a question talking about food, and I talked about my favorite meal in that context: barbecue chicken, cabbage, and rice. And I just looked at that meal, and I encourage all to look at that. Chicken is, first of all, agriculture is the #1 export of our country. We're the #1 exporter of agriculture in the world. The United States is. Poultry, chicken is one of the largest, if not the largest, export around agriculture. The South has the top of the 5 producers of chicken are in the South. Cabbage, 4 of the top 5 producers in the United States are in the South. 3 of the top 5 producers of rice are in the South. So just a meal like that, you're talking about the production primarily coming from the South. But South is the poorest region in the country. And that's because the infrastructure around chicken, the infrastructure to process and market cabbage, rice, it's not owned by our communities. It's not owned by farmers. It's not owned in the South. It's these corporations. And they're getting rich off the assets of the region, the assets of farmers. So for me, legislation has to be geared toward ownership. It has to be geared toward ownership of infrastructure. So we have to make sure the infrastructure around all these industries are collectively or cooperatively owned and shared by the people of the communities of these regions of our country. And until we have that, poverty will constantly be perpetuated, because it's policy that perpetuates it. Policy is nothing more than the distribution and redistribution of resources. So where are our resources being distributed? They're not being distributed in the South. They're not being distributed around the infrastructure. They're being distributed everywhere where the money flows back to. And that's what the policy has to focus on.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask this last question. What other ways can we support your work on behalf of land acquisition for new and younger farmers?
So one, I would say in terms of, I think these conversations are extremely helpful. Having this conversation so that we start to become aware of all of the issues, because agriculture is a big pot, but there's a number of players within it. There's a number of regions. So really getting an understanding. And again, this is a start. How do we start understanding the challenges that we all face? Because the solutions are going to stop the runoff that happened in Toledo. So when we start understanding the challenges so that we can start being a part of the solution, really understand the issues, then start educating. Let's start educating each other about all the issues. And more importantly, let's start making sure that when we have the conversations that we have diversity at the table to come up with the policies, to come up with the solutions, and we're all pushing them collectively. So I say around education, around awareness, around training, but also the resources. Where we see resources, we have to make sure the resources are pointed in the right places. It does no good if everybody in the country gets the resources, but the farmers who are expected to be the vanguards or be on the front lines of these things don't get them. So making sure the resources go to the right places and to make sure that we're able to build the infrastructure. Until there's the policy, we have to spend the resources there and build these alternative systems. So talking about it, educating about it, being aware, but also pointing resources back to these kind of places, these kind of efforts. Thank you. And thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for having me. I look forward to working with some of you and seeing you down the road in some other ways. And let's figure out how we continue to do this work.